The house was quiet in that way North Carolina houses get quiet in late October, when the light falls sideways through the windows, and the only sound is the refrigerator hum and your own breathing. Leo sat at the kitchen table with the lottery check folded in his wallet, a number so large it felt like a joke someone had played on him, and he stared at the phone in his hand like it might tell him what to do next. He'd bought the ticket on a Tuesday. Stopping at the gas station on his way home from a job, he'd already decided to leave. The woman behind the counter had smiled at him the way she smiled at everyone, disinterested and automatic, and he'd picked the numbers without thinking. His birthday, his mother's birthday, the year he and Marco had climbed the steps of the Campanile in Venice and looked down at the city spread out like a map of somewhere they could never actually live. 2 days later, he was $8 million richer and still sitting in the same house with the same quiet, the same refrigerator hum, the same sideways October light. He'd told no one, not his ex-wife, not his grown daughter, not the few friends who still called on birthdays. The check sat in his wallet like a secret too heavy to carry alone. He dialed the number from memory, the same 10 digits he'd known for 38 years. The phone rang once, twice, and then the line opened, and there was that voice, rougher now, older, but still unmistakably Marco's. The voice that had yelled at him from the other end of a pool lane, that had whispered through the dark of a shared bunk during summer camp, that had laughed at bad jokes in shitty Italian discos, and never once made him feel small for being the quieter one.
You finally won something.
Leo smiled, his first real smile in weeks.
How'd you know?
Because you never call on a Tuesday unless you've got something to say. And you sound different. You sound like you did that time you stole your father's car and drove us to Jesolo in the middle of the night.
Leo remembered that night. The smell of salt and cheap wine, the sound of waves he couldn't see in the dark, Marco laughing with his head out the window like a dog, the taste of freedom so sharp it hurt.
I won the lottery, Marco. The state won $8 million.
Silence on the line. A long, patient silence, the kind Marco had always been able to hold. Leo could hear the ocean in the background, a distant crash and retreat, and he pictured Marco standing on some Texas beach with the phone pressed to his ear, squinting into the same sun that had followed them from Vicenza to Livorno to every godforsaken place their father's orders had taken them.
8 millions.
8 million.
That's a lot of train tickets.
Leo laughed, and it felt strange in his chest, like a muscle he hadn't used in years.
I'm buying the tickets. We're going back.
Another silence, but this one was different. This one was Marco thinking, the way he always thought before he said something important. A pause that had saved them from bad decisions more times than Leo could count, and led them into even better ones.
Back where?
All of it: Vicenza, Venice, Verona, Jesolo, Madonna di Campiglio, Livorno, Florence, all the places we said we'd go back to when we had money and time.
Leo heard Marco exhale, long and slow, the sound of a man letting go of something he'd been holding for decades.
You know you can never go back.
I know.
So we're going to try anyway.
Yeah, we're going to try anyway.
The refrigerator hummed. The October light shifted. Leo looked at the check in his wallet and thought about all the years he'd spent chasing money he didn't need, filling a house with things that didn't matter, building a life that looked good from the outside and felt hollow from the inside. He thought about Marco, who had stayed close to the water, who had worked jobs that paid enough and no more, who had never stopped being the boy who could find a party in an empty room.
I'm sitting here in this house, Marco. It's a nice house. Big kitchen, 3 bathrooms, a yard I don't use, and I'm just sitting here.
That's what money does. It makes you sit still and wonder why you ever wanted it.
Leo nodded, even though Marco couldn't see him.
When was the last time we saw each other?
Your mother's funeral 12 years ago.
12 years.
12 years is too long.
The wind picked up on Marco's end, and Leo heard the sound of a door opening, then closing.
I'm coming inside. The wind's picking up out here. But I'm coming inside and I'm going to sit down and you're going to tell me what you're really thinking.
Leo leaned back in his chair. The kitchen was clean, too clean, the way a house gets when no one really lives in it. He'd been meaning to cook something, but he couldn't remember the last time he'd been hungry.
I'm thinking about the pool, that first day at the base pool when we were 12. You were already on the swim team and I couldn't even do a proper flip turn. You showed me how to push off the wall without losing my breath.
You learned fast and
You taught me fast, you always did.
Marco laughed, a low sound that carried the warmth of summers they'd shared.
I taught you how to drink cheap beer in a piazza in Vicenza. I taught you how to talk to Italian girls who didn't speak English. I taught you how to get out of a fight you started and into a fight you could win.
You taught me how to live.
The word hung in the air between them, across the miles, across the years. Leo felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of a knot he hadn't known was there.
So when do we leave?
How soon can you get to Raleigh?
I'll be there tomorrow.
Leo looked at the kitchen clock. It was 4:47 in the afternoon. The light was beginning to fade and the house was growing darker, but for the first time in a long time, he didn't mind the quiet.
I'll pick you up at the airport.
You better have good wine waiting.
I'll have the good wine.
And Leo,
Yo.
thank you.
Leo didn't answer. He didn't need to. He sat in the quiet kitchen as the light left the room, and he listened to Marco breathe on the other end of the line, and he thought about all the years they'd spent apart, all the miles, all the quiet houses and hollow victories, and he knew that no matter what happened next, this was already the best thing the money had ever bought him. He sat there a long time after they hung up, the phone warm in his hand, the lottery check forgotten in his wallet, and he let himself remember. He sat there a long time after they hung up, the phone warm in his hand, the lottery check forgotten in his wallet, and he let himself remember. The base pool at Caserma Ederle smelled like chlorine and childhood. It was an Olympic-sized thing indoor, with windows high up that let in the pale November light of northern Italy, and the air was always wet and heavy, thick with the sound of bodies hitting water and coaches whistling, and the slap of bare feet on wet tile. Leo had been on the base for 3 months, long enough to learn that the American kids had their own world inside the Italian one, and that the pool was where that world made the most sense. He was 12 years old, tall for his age, blonde hair bleached by a summer he'd spent mostly indoors, blue eyes that hadn't yet learned to look away from a challenge. He stood at the edge of the lane, watching the older kids do their flip turns, and he felt the familiar weight of being the new kid, the one who didn't know the routines, the one who would have to prove himself. That was when Marco surfaced. He came up from a lap like he was born to it, water streaming off his face, the same blue eyes, the same blonde hair, the same Nordic architecture of bone and muscle that marked them both as the kind of American kids who grew up on bases in Europe, who looked like they belonged on a wheat farm in Minnesota, but somehow ended up in a military town in the Veneto. Marco pulled off his goggles and looked at Leo standing there, and he grinned.
You know,
Yeah, I just got here from Germany.
Germany, that's rough, the water's better here.
Marco pulled himself out of the pool, water sluicing off his shoulders, and stood beside Leo, looking at the lane he'd just finished.
You know how to do a flip turn.
Not really, I mean I've tried, but I always come up wrong.
That's because you're thinking about it, you gotta stop thinking.
Marco dropped back into the water without warning, pushed off the wall, and did a perfect flip turn, coming up clean and fast, his body a machine made for water. He surfaced and looked at Leo.
See, no thinking, just feel.
Leo took a breath, stepped to the edge, and dove in. The water hit him cold and clean, and he swam toward the wall, trying to remember what Marco had said, trying to let his body do what his mind couldn't figure out. He hit the wall, flipped, and came up sideways, gasping water up his nose. Marco was laughing.
Close, you almost had it, try again.
They spent the rest of practice working on it. Marco stayed beside him, patient in a way that 12-year-old boys rarely were, correcting his angle, showing him how to tuck his chin, how to use his core to generate the momentum. By the end of the session, Leo could do a flip turn that wasn't pretty, but it worked. And when he surfaced from the last one, Marco was nodding.
See, I told you, you learn fast.
That was it, that was the moment. They walked out of the pool together, towels around their necks, the chlorine clinging to their skin, and they sat on the bleachers while the other kids filed past, their father's names stitched onto their swim bags, their lives measured in PCS moves and tour rotations. Leo's father was a sergeant first class infantry. Marco's father was a warrant officer, aviation. They were both Army, both career, both destined to drag their families from base to base until the kids grew up and scattered like seeds in the wind. But that afternoon, none of that mattered. What mattered was that Leo had found someone who didn't make him feel like the new kid. What mattered was that Marco had found someone who would try, who would fail, who would try again. What mattered was that they were 12, and the world was still small enough to hold in the palm of your hand. They sat there until the janitor came to lock up, talking about nothing and everything, the way boys do when they're not trying to impress anyone. Marco told him about the Italian kids who lived off base, about the piazza in Vicenza where the older kids drank beer and smoked cigarettes, about the girls who walked past the base gate in pairs, their laughter carrying across the street like a dare. Leo listened and nodded and felt something settle inside him, a sense of belonging he hadn't known he was missing. When they finally left, the air outside was cold and damp, the November sky a pale gray, and the base lights were coming on, casting long shadows across the parking lot. Marco's mother was waiting in a blue station wagon, and Leo's father was supposed to pick him up in 20 minutes, so they stood at the edge of the lot, not wanting to say goodbye.
Same time tomorrow.
Same time tomorrow.
Marco jogged to his mother's car, and Leo watched him go, and he knew with the certainty that only children have that this was the beginning of something. He didn't know what. He didn't know how long it would last. He didn't know that they would spend the next 6 years inseparable, that they would grow into their bodies and their voices and their hunger for the world, that they would chase girls and drink wine and get into fights and get out of them, that they would learn to speak Italian badly and flirt worse, that they would stand on the roof of a building in Vicenza one summer night and watch the stars and talk about the future like it was a city they could walk to. He didn't know any of that. He just knew that when Marco's car pulled away, the parking lot felt emptier and the base lights felt dimmer and the air felt colder, and he was already looking forward to tomorrow. His father's car pulled up, a green sedan with government plates, and Leo got in without saying much. His father asked how practice went, and Leo said fine, and his father nodded, and they drove back to their quarters in silence, the way they always did. But that night, lying in his bed in the dark, Leo could still smell the chlorine on his skin. He could still feel the water closing over his head, the wall under his feet, the rush of air when he surfaced. He could still hear Marco's voice, patient and sure, telling him to stop thinking. He fell asleep with the smile of a boy who had found his person, and he dreamed of swimming in a pool that went on forever, Marco beside him, the water warm and clear and no walls in sight. The first beer was Marco's idea. It was April, a year and a half after they'd met, and they were 13 now, or almost. Marco's birthday was in June, Leo's in August, and 13 was old enough, Marco said, to be tired of being treated like a kid. They met behind the maintenance shed near the rear of base housing, where the fence sagged and the weeds grew tall and no one ever came. Marco had stolen 4 cans of Peroni from his uncle's fridge, his mother's brother, visiting from Naples, who drank like a fish and wouldn't notice, and he carried them in a gym bag, clinking softly as he walked. Leo was already there, sitting on an overturned crate, his knees pulled up to his chest. The sun was going down, and the sky was the color of a bruise, purple and yellow and gray, and the air smelled like cut grass and diesel from the motor pool a quarter-mile away.
You ready?
Marco pulled out a can. The metal was cool and damp in the evening air. Leo took it, held it in his hands, looked at the label like it was a map to some foreign country. He wasn't ready, but he wasn't going to say that.
You gotta pop the tab first, you know that, right?
Leo popped the tab. The hiss was loud in the quiet lot. Marco popped his own, raised it in a mock toast.
To growing up.
To growing up.
They drank. The beer was warm and bitter and thin, and it tasted like nothing Leo had ever imagined beer would taste like. He'd watched his father drink it for years, watched the way he'd settle into his chair after a long day, watched the way his shoulders would drop, watched the way the can would empty and the tension would drain out of him. He'd assumed it tasted like freedom. It tasted like regret and carbonated bread. He coughed, Marco coughed too, then laughed, then coughed again.
Take some getting used to.
That's awful.
Yeah, that's the point.
They drank more. The second can went down easier than the first, or maybe they were just getting numb to it, or maybe the night was doing something to their taste buds, numbing them the way it numbed everything else. The sky darkened. The base lights came on. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked and another answered. Leo leaned back against the shed wall, the wood rough through his shirt, and looked up at the stars. They were faint here, washed out by the lights of the base, but he could see a few, scattered like salt on a dark tablecloth.
You ever think about what happens after?
After what?
After this, after high school, after we leave.
Marco was quiet for a moment. He took another sip of his beer, then set it down on the ground between his feet.
I try not to.
Me neither.
But they both did. They thought about it all the time. The shadow of the next PCS move hung over every friendship, every season, every moment of happiness. It was the thing no one talked about, the clock that was always ticking, the countdown that started the day you arrived. Marco picked up a pebble, tossed it at the fence. It clattered through the chain link and disappeared into the dark beyond.
We still got time.
How much?
I don't know, a few years.
A few years, it sounded like forever when you were 13. It sounded like nothing when you were 33. Leo finished his second can, crushed it against his knee the way he'd seen older kids do, and set it beside the first. Marco handed him a third, and he took it without thinking, without wanting it, because that was what you did. The beer was warming up now, the can sitting in the grass, and the taste was getting worse, not better. But Leo didn't care. He was sitting in the dark with his best friend, doing something they weren't supposed to do, and that was enough.
My brother told me something.
Yeah.
He said there's a girl in his class. Her name is Alina.
Marco said the name carefully, the way you say a word you're still learning to pronounce. Elena. The vowels rolled off his tongue like water.
What about her?
He said she's pretty. He said she has dark hair and dark eyes and she laughs at everything.
Leo waited. Marco didn't say anything else. He just sat there, staring at the fence, his face unreadable in the dim light.
You like her?
I don't know, I haven't met her.
But Leo could hear it in his voice, that thing that happens when a boy starts to notice a girl, when the world gets bigger and smaller at the same time. He didn't know what to do with it. He didn't know what to say. So he said nothing. They drank their beers, and the night got darker, and the stars got a little brighter, and somewhere on the other side of the base, a stereo was playing Italian pop that Leo didn't recognize, the bass thumping through the walls, the notes carrying across the parking lots like a promise. When the third can was empty, Marco stood up stretched, his spine cracking in the quiet.
We should probably get back.
Leo stood, too, and the ground tilted a little under his feet. Not much, just enough to notice, just enough to make him smile.
I think I'm a little drunk.
You're not, that's just the carbonation.
No, I think I'm drunk.
Marco laughed and Leo laughed, and they gathered the empty cans and stuffed them back into the gym bag, to be thrown away somewhere far from the shed, somewhere no one would find them. They walked to the edge of the lot where the path split, Marco's quarters to the left, Leo's to the right. The base was quiet now, the last light flickering out in a window here and there, the night settling over everything like a blanket.
Same time tomorrow.
Same time tomorrow.
Marco jogged off into the dark, and Leo watched him go, a shadow among shadows, and then he turned and walked home, the taste of warm beer still on his tongue, the smell of cut grass and diesel still in his nose, the feeling of having done something forbidden still buzzing in his chest. He didn't sleep well that night. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, his stomach turning over, his head spinning just a little, and he thought about Alina, a girl he'd never met, a girl with dark hair and dark eyes, a girl who laughed at everything. He thought about Marco, and about the years they had left, and about the countdown that was always ticking, and he decided, lying there in the dark, that he would make every second count. He wouldn't have to try very hard. Some friendships are like that. They don't need effort, they don't need maintenance, they just exist like gravity, like the air you breathe, like the water in a pool that holds you up when you stop fighting it. Some friendships are like that. And Leo, 13 years old, warm beer buzz fading, lay in his narrow bed in his narrow room on a narrow base in a foreign country, and he knew that he had found one of those friendships. He fell asleep smiling, and when he dreamed of swimming in a pool that went on forever, Marco beside him, and no walls in sight. 37 years later, Leo stood at gate B12 in the Raleigh-Durham airport, a single duffel bag at his feet, and watched the departure board flicker through its rotations. The numbers and cities changed like they meant something, like they were trying to tell him something about time and distance, and the difference between where you are and where you want to be. He had called Marco 6 weeks ago, 6 weeks and 3 days. He remembered because it was a Tuesday, because the lottery office had deposited the money on a Monday, because he had sat in his quiet house in Kerry for a full 24 hours before he picked up the phone, and during those hours he had done nothing but stare at the number in his checking account and feel the strange weight of it, the way it sat there like a stone in his chest. The call had lasted 11 minutes. He knew that because he had looked at the call log afterward, had saved it, had looked at it again the next day and the day after that. 11 minutes. That was how long it took to change everything. He had said something about the money. He had said something about wanting to do something, anything, before the years piled up any higher, before the countdown reached 0 without him noticing. Marco had been quiet for a long time, not the kind of quiet that means you're thinking about how to say no. The kind of quiet that means you're already packing a bag in your head. The gate area filled and emptied around him. Families with small children, businessmen in suits that cost more than his first car, a woman in her 60s traveling alone, a paperback tucked under her arm. Leo watched them all with the mild curiosity of a man who no longer had to be anywhere or do anything. He was 50 years old. He had spent 30 of those years building a career in enterprise software, which was a phrase that had never meant anything to him except that he knew how to make companies pay for things they didn't understand. He had done well. He had done very well. And then, in the space of a single Tuesday evening, he had done better than he had ever imagined. The lottery had not changed him. That was what he told himself. What it had done was simpler than that. It had given him permission to stop pretending that he was anything other than what he had always been. The boarding announcement came over the speakers, a woman's voice flattened by the PA system, the words dissolving into static at the edges. Leo picked up his duffel and joined the line, his passport in his hand, his boarding pass folded in his pocket. The flight was full. He had a window seat, 14A, and he sat there with his knees pressed against the seat in front of him, too tall for the space, too old to pretend it didn't bother him. The plane pushed back from the gate, the engines spooling up, the vibration working its way through the floor and into his bones. He closed his eyes and thought about Marco. He thought about the last time they had seen each other, 10 years ago, when Leo had flown to Corpus Christi for a weekend. Marco had met him at the airport in a truck that had seen better decades, and they had driven to a bar on the water, and they had drunk too much and talked about nothing and everything, and then Leo had flown home and they had gone back to their lives. That was what happened. That was what always happened. You saw each other, you picked up where you left off, you promised to do it again, and then you didn't. Not because you didn't mean it, because life was a current and the current was stronger than you remembered. The plane lifted off, the ground falling away, and Leo watched the coast recede through the window, the line where the land met the Atlantic, the pale green of the water, the white of the foam. He thought about Vicenza. He thought about the pool, the chlorine smell, the tile floor wet under his bare feet. He thought about Marco's laugh, the way it started in his chest and worked its way out, the way it made you want to laugh too, even if you didn't know what was funny. He thought about the years between then and now, the way they had condensed into something smaller, something that didn't feel like 37 years at all. 2.5 hours later, the plane touched down in Houston. Leo walked through the terminal, past the shops and the food courts and the people standing at the baggage claim with their phones in their hands, and he found Marco standing near the exit, leaning against a pillar, his arms crossed, the same way he had leaned against the fence at the pool when they were kids. Marco was bigger now. Not fat, just solid, the way men get when they've spent their lives working with their hands, when they've spent their lives on the water. His face was lined, his hair gray at the temples, his eyes the same dark brown they had always been, the same eyes that had watched Leo crush a beer can against his knee 37 years ago. They looked at each other across the terminal. The crowd moved around them, oblivious. And then Marco smiled, that same smile, the one that started in his chest and worked its way out.
You look old.
Leo laughed. It came out rough, the way laughter does when you haven't used it in a while.
You look the same.
That's because you're old and your eyes are going.
They stood there, not moving, not shaking hands, not hugging, just standing there in the middle of the terminal. Two men in their 50s who had known each other since they were boys, and the years between them were nothing, were everything, were the air in the room. Marco reached out and took the duffel bag from Leo's hand, slung it over his own shoulder, and turned toward the exit.
I got a truck, it's not pretty, but it runs.
They walked out into the Houston heat, heavy and wet, the kind of heat that wraps around you like a blanket, and Leo followed Marco across the parking lot to a battered Ford F-150 that had rust in the wheel wells and a dent in the passenger door. Leo climbed in. The seat was hot. The air smelled like salt and dust and something else, something familiar, something he couldn't name. Marco got in on the other side, started the engine, and pulled out of the lot without saying a word. They drove for a while, past the strip malls and the gas stations and the endless, flat horizon of the Texas coastal plain. Marco drove the way he had always moved through the world, without hurry, without hesitation, as if he had all the time in the world and knew exactly how to spend it. The sun was starting to drop, the light turning orange, the shadows stretching long across the road.
So, you want to tell me about it?
Leo looked out the window. The highway stretched ahead of them, empty and straight, the kind of road that made you feel like you could drive forever.
I won the lottery.
I heard that parts.
It's a lot of money.
How much is a lot?
Leo told him. Marco whistled low and long, and then he was quiet for a moment, his hands steady on the wheel.
What are you going to do with it?
Leo had been asking himself that question for 6 weeks. He had asked it in the shower, in the kitchen, in the middle of the night when he couldn't sleep. He had made lists. He had done research. He had talked to a financial advisor, a lawyer, an accountant, and none of it had answered the question. He had come to understand, slowly, that the question itself was wrong. It wasn't about what he was going to do with the money. It was about what he was going to do with the time.
I want to go back.
Marco glanced at him, then back at the road.
Back where?
Leo didn't answer right away. He watched the road, the sky, the fields of scrub grass and sage that stretched to the horizon.
Vicenza.
The word hung in the air between them. Marco said nothing. The truck hummed along the highway, the engine a steady, patient sound.
You want to visit?
No.
Leo paused, feeling the weight of what he was about to say, the audacity of it, the impossibility.
I want to live it just for a while the way we did then, all the places. Vicenza, Venice, Jesolo, the mountains, all of it.
The silence stretched. The sun dropped lower, the sky turning deeper, the heat beginning to ease.
You're serious?
I'm serious.
Marco took a breath, let it out slow. He didn't look at Leo, but his hands tightened on the wheel just slightly, just enough.
I got a boat, it's not much. I keep it at a marina near Port Aransas. I take it out when I can, which is less than I'd like. I spend my days fixing things for people, fixing engines, fixing pipes, fixing whatever breaks. I live in a house that's too small and too close to the road, but it's mine. I'm not unhappy, Leo, that's not what I'm saying.
I know.
But I'm not happy either.
Leo didn't know how to respond to that. He didn't think Marco wanted a response. He thought Marco was just saying it out loud, the way you do when you're talking to someone who doesn't need you to explain.
When do we leave?
Leo felt something loosen in his chest, something he hadn't realized was tight.
I was thinking next week.
That's fast.
The countdown's still ticking.
Marco nodded. He didn't say anything else. He just drove, the road unwinding ahead of them, and the sunset spread across the sky like a promise. The flight from Houston to Venice was long, and Leo spent most of it looking out the window, watching the continent slide by beneath them, green and brown and blue, the gridwork of farms giving way to mountains, giving way to the pale edge of the Atlantic. Marco slept. He had a gift for it, the same gift he had had at 15, the ability to shut his eyes and disappear into sleep anywhere, anytime, on a bus, on a bench, on the tile floor of a locker room after a swim meet. Leo had always envied that. They landed in the late morning. The air at Marco Polo Airport smelled different than Leo remembered, diesel and coffee and something floral, something that might have been jasmine, might have been nothing at all. They collected their bags, rented a car, a small Fiat that seemed almost comically inadequate for 2 men who had spent their lives driving American trucks and sedans. Marco took the wheel. He drove on the wrong side of the road without hesitation, as if he had been doing it his whole life, and Leo let him. The highway from Venice to Vicenza was straight and flat, the fields on either side green and orderly, the sort of fields that had been farmed for 1,000 years, and looked it. The light was different here, softer, older. Leo rolled down the window and let the air hit his face, and for a moment he felt something like vertigo, the sensation of being in a place that was both completely familiar and completely strange.
It's smaller.
Leo nodded. He had been thinking the same thing. The road, the fields, the sky, all of it seemed to have shrunk, as if the memories had inflated everything in the years since he had left.
I remember it being bigger.
Everything's bigger when you're 12.
They drove through the outskirts of Vicenza, past the industrial zones and the newer buildings, the kind of growth that had happened in the decades since they had left. Leo tried to orient himself, to find the landmarks he remembered, but everything was just slightly off, like a photograph that had been moved a few inches to the left. Then they turned a corner, and there it was, the gates of Caserma Ederl, the American flag, the guard booth, the white buildings beyond, neat and orderly and utterly unchanged. Marco pulled over to the side of the road. They sat there for a moment, the engine idling, neither of them speaking. Leo looked at the gates, at the flag, at the long driveway that led into the base, and he felt something shift in his chest, something that might have been grief, might have been joy, might have been both.
You want to go in?
Leo thought about it. He thought about the guard at the booth, the ID checks, the explanations. He thought about walking those streets again, seeing the houses, the school, the pool.
Not today.
Marco nodded. He put the car in gear and pulled back onto the road. They found a hotel near the center of town, a small place with a courtyard and a fountain and a woman at the front desk who spoke English with a heavy accent and smiled at them like she knew something they didn't. Leo checked them in, 2 rooms, side by side, and they dropped their bags and stood in the hallway for a moment, looking at each other.
Now what?
We walk.
They walked out of the hotel down the narrow streets past the cafes and the shops and the churches that had been standing for centuries. Vicenza was the same but different. The buildings were the same height, the same pale stone, the same red tile roofs. But the spaces between them felt narrower, the streets shorter, the distances smaller. They walked to the Piazza dei Signori, the big square with the Basilica Palladiana and the Torre di Piazza, the clock tower that Leo had looked at 1,000 times without really seeing it. They stood in the middle of the piazza, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the cobblestones, and Leo felt the weight of the years pressing down on him.
We used to come here on Saturdays.
Marco nodded. He was looking at the tower, his hands in his pockets, his face unreadable.
We'd get gelato and sit on the steps and watch the girls go by.
And we'd pretend we knew what we were talking about.
We didn't know anything.
Leo laughed, a short, dry sound. It was true. They hadn't known anything. They had been 16, 17, full of opinions and certainties that had dissolved like sugar in water the moment they hit the real world. They walked on, through the narrow streets, past the old city walls, down toward the river. The Retroni was running low, the water clear and shallow, and Leo stopped on the bridge and leaned on the railing and watched it flow. He remembered standing on this bridge with Marco years ago, the 2 of them smoking cigarettes they had bought from a machine in a bar, coughing and laughing and feeling like outlaws. The cigarettes had tasted terrible. The freedom had tasted like nothing else. They walked to the old bars, the ones that had been their haunts when they were old enough to get in but young enough to feel like they were getting away with something. Most of them were still there, their names unchanged, their signs faded but legible. Leo stopped in front of one, a place called Il Ritrovo, and looked at the door.
Remember the night we snuck out?
Which night?
The one with the Australian girls.
Marco smiled. It was a rare thing, that smile, and it changed his face completely, made him look younger, lighter.
I remember you tried to order in Italian and the bartender laughed at you.
He laughed at both of us.
He had good reasons.
They stood there for a moment, the memory hanging between them, vivid and warm. Then Marco pushed open the door and they went inside. The bar was dark, cool, unchanged. The same wooden tables, the same worn floor, the same smell of beer and old wood and something faintly sweet. A man behind the counter looked up, nodded at them, and went back to wiping a glass. They ordered 2 beers. They sat at a table near the window and drank them slowly, not saying much, the silence comfortable and full. Outside, the light began to fade. The street lamps came on, casting pools of yellow light on the cobblestones. A few people walked by, their voices low, their footsteps echoing off the old stone walls. Leo finished his beer and set the glass down.
It's the same.
It's not the same.
Leo looked at him. Marco was staring at his own glass, turning it slowly in his hands.
We're not the same, so it can't be the same, but it's close enough.
Leo thought about that. He thought about the base, the pool, the discos, the mountains. He thought about all the places they were going to go, all the things they were going to try to recapture. And he thought about what Marco had said about being close enough.
Is that enough?
Marco looked up. His eyes were steady, clear, the same eyes that had looked at Leo across 1,000 pool decks, 1,000 dinner tables, 1,000 late-night conversations.
It has to be.
They sat there for a long time, the night settling around them, the bar growing quiet, the beer growing warm. Neither of them moved to leave. Neither of them wanted to. The past was waiting outside, in the streets, in the shadows, in the sound of the river. But for this moment they were here together, and that was enough. The door of Il Ritrovo opened again, letting in a slice of the violet evening and the sound of a woman's laugh. Leo looked up, not expecting anything, and then he saw her. She was standing in the doorway, backlit, her hair the same dark spill he remembered, her face older but still sharp, still knowing. She saw him at the same moment he saw her, and for a second neither of them moved.
Leo.
Her voice was lower than he remembered, or maybe he was just older and everything had shifted a little.
Chiara.
She walked over. She moved the same way she had at 17, a kind of deliberate grace that had always made him feel clumsy and young. She pulled out a chair and sat down without asking, her eyes moving between him and Marco.
Marco.
Hey, Chiara.
She smiled, and it was the same smile, too, the one that had broken his heart 100 times without her ever knowing.
I heard you were in town. The base grapevine is still alive. My mother still lives in the same apartment, and she called me. Said someone saw 2 Americans at the old market looking lost.
We weren't lost.
You looked lost, that's what she said.
Marco laughed, a low sound that seemed to surprise him.
She's not wrong.
Chiara leaned back in her chair. She was wearing a simple dress, dark blue, and a silver necklace that caught the dim light. She looked like she belonged here in this bar in this city, like she had never left.
So you came back.
We're trying to.
Trying.
He didn't know how to answer that. He looked at Marco, but Marco was watching Chiara with a kind of quiet attention that Leo recognized. It was the same way Marco had always watched her, years ago, when they were all too young to know what they were doing.
It's complicated.
It always was with you too.
She signaled the bartender, who brought her a glass of wine without her having to say anything. She took a sip, then set the glass down and looked at them both, her eyes soft and unreadable.
I stayed.
We know.
I married an Italian, a real one, not a base boy. We have 2 kids. I work at the university now, teaching English literature.
You always loved that.
You remembered.
He had remembered. He remembered everything about her. The way she laughed, the way she smelled like lavender and cigarettes, the way she had kissed him once on the night before his family left, and then walked away without looking back.
You should come to dinner tomorrow night. My husband makes a decent pasta. The kids are loud and the house is small, but it's warm.
Leo looked at Marco. Marco shrugged, a small, almost imperceptible movement.
We'd like that.
Good.
She finished her wine in one long swallow, then stood up. She touched Leo's shoulder briefly, a gesture that felt like a benediction.
It's good to see you both. You look like yourselves.
She walked out, the door swinging shut behind her, and the bar fell quiet again. Leo stared at the space where she had been, the air still holding the trace of her perfume.
She's happy.
Yo.
That's good.
Leo nodded. It was good. He had no claim on her, had never had a real claim on her, not really. But seeing her happy, seeing her whole in a life that had nothing to do with him, it felt like a door closing. Quietly, gently, but closing all the same. They left Il Ritrovo and walked back out into the piazza. The night had settled fully now, the sky a deep, bruised blue, the stars just beginning to show. The basilica was lit up, its columns throwing long shadows across the stone. A group of teenagers sat on the steps, laughing, their voices loud and careless. One of them had a guitar, and he was strumming badly, the chords wrong, but no one seemed to mind.
That was us.
We were worse.
We were worse at everything.
They walked across the piazza, past the fountain, past the couples holding hands, past the old men reading newspapers on benches. The city was alive in a way it hadn't been during the day, softer, more forgiving. Near the far end of the square, a woman was selling flowers from a cart. Leo stopped, looked at the buckets of roses and daisies, and something yellow he didn't recognize.
I used to buy her flowers.
Chiara.
Yeah, from a cart just like this. I'd spend my whole allowance on a bunch of roses, and she'd smile and thank me, and then I'd watch her throw them in the trash the next day.
She didn't throw them in the trash.
She did. I saw her once from the window of the bus. She tossed them in a bin outside her apartment.
Marco was quiet for a long moment. Then he put his hand on Leo's shoulder, the way he used to when they were kids, when one of them had said something too honest, and the other didn't know what to do with it.
That's the thing about coming back. You remember the good stuff, and then the bad stuff shows up to keep it company.
Leo looked at the flowers. The yellow ones were tulips, he realized, bright, simple, unpretentious.
I don't think I'd buy her flowers now.
What would you buy her?
Nothing. I'd just be glad she's here, that she's okay.
Marco nodded. They stood there a little longer, the smell of the flowers mixing with the stone and the warm night air and the distant sound of the river. They turned and walked back toward the hotel, their footsteps echoing off the old walls. The city wrapped around them like a blanket, familiar and strange at once. And Leo thought about what Marco had said, about the bad stuff showing up to keep the good company. He thought about Chiara, about the roses in the trash, about the kiss she had given him that he had carried across an ocean and an entire life. He thought about the ones who had stayed, not just Chiara, but all of them, the ones who had never left this city, who had built lives in the shadow of the same towers, the same hills, the same river. They had kept going, steady and patient, while he and Marco had gone out into the world and tried to become something else. And now they were back, standing in the middle of the life they had left behind, and it was still here, still warm, still waiting.
Same time tomorrow.
Same time.
They walked the last block in silence, the hotel lights glowing ahead, and Leo felt something loosen in his chest. Something he had been carrying for so long he had forgotten it was there. Next evening, they found themselves at a different kind of place. A trattoria tucked down a side street, its entrance barely visible behind a cascade of ivy. The owner was an old woman with flour on her apron and a face that had seen too many winters. She sat them at a corner table, brought them bread and wine without asking, and disappeared into the kitchen. Leo had made the call that morning, a number he had kept in an old address book, the paper yellowed and soft at the folds. He had dialed before he could think better of it, and when a woman's voice answered, he had almost hung up. Elena, she had been a year ahead of them at Vicenza American High School. Tall, dark hair that she wore long and loose, a laugh that could fill a room. She had been the first girl Leo had ever kissed, behind the bleachers at the swim meet in Livorno, the smell of chlorine still in his hair. She arrived 20 minutes late, apologizing in a rush of Italian and English that sounded like music. She was still beautiful, not in the way she had been at 17, the kind of beauty that seemed careless and invincible, but in a different way. Softer, more careful. The lines around her eyes spoke of laughter and worry in equal measure.
Leo, Marco, look at you.
She hugged them both, and Leo caught the scent of her perfume, something floral, something that reminded him of spring in Vicenza, the wisteria that climbed the walls of the old palazzos. She sat down, reached for the wine bottle, and poured herself a glass before anyone could speak.
I almost didn't come.
Why?
Because I wasn't sure I wanted to remember that time. I wasn't sure I wanted to see who I used to be.
She said it without bitterness, just a simple statement of fact. Leo watched her, trying to find the girl he had known in the woman across from him. She was there, in the way she tilted her head when she laughed, in the way she gestured with her hands, the wine sloshing dangerously close to the rim of her glass. The conversation started easy. Old teachers, old friends, the shape of the town before they had all grown up and scattered. Elena told them about her life. A husband who worked in a factory in Verona, 2 children, a house with a garden where she grew tomatoes and basil.
It's not the life I imagined, but it's mine.
Leo nodded. He thought about his own life, the house in North Carolina, the job that had paid him more than he knew what to do with, the silence that had grown deeper every year. Marco asked about the others, the ones who had stayed, the ones who had left, the ones who had died. Elena's face shifted, a shadow passing over it.
Do you remember Sarah?
The blonde girl's the one with the laughs.
She died 5 years ago, cancer. She was 34.
The table went quiet. Leo stared at his wine glass, the light catching the deep red, refracting into 1,000 tiny stars. Elena reached across the table and touched his hand.
I'm sorry, I shouldn't have.
No, it's good, I want to know.
She held his gaze for a moment, then let go. She leaned back in her chair, her eyes distant, as if she was looking at something far away that only she could see.
We were all so young, we thought we had forever, and then we didn't.
The old woman brought out plates of pasta, steam rising in the cool air. They ate in silence for a while, the only sounds the clink of forks and the low murmur of conversation from the other tables. Leo thought about Sarah. He remembered her as a blur of blonde hair and laughter, always at the edge of things, never quite in the center. He had never known her well, not really, but he had known her. She had been part of the fabric of his youth, a thread he had assumed would always be there. And now she was gone. Elena put down her fork.
Do you ever wonder why we're the ones who lived?
Every day.
She looked at Marco, her eyes unreadable.
That's honest, most people lie about that.
I'm too old to lie.
She laughed, but it was a sad laugh, the kind that comes from a place that has seen too much. They finished the wine. The old woman brought out a bottle of limoncello, and they drank it in small sips, the sweetness cutting through the heaviness of the meal. Elena told them about the ones who had gotten away. Not just the dead, but the ones who had drifted, the ones who had changed so completely that they were unrecognizable. She told them about a boy named Daniel who had become a pastor, and a girl named Rachel who had moved to Thailand and never come back. She told them about the ones who had stayed in Vicenza, the ones who had married locals and grown old in the shadow of the base.
You two were lucky you got to leave.
Lucky.
Yes, you got to choose. The rest of us, we just stayed.
Leo thought about that. He thought about all the choices he had made, all the doors he had walked through, all the ones he had left closed. He had left. He had chosen to leave, and he had never really thought about what that meant for the ones who had stayed. Marco poured the last of the limoncello into their glasses.
We came back.
You came back to visit. That's not the same.
She stood up, smoothed her dress, and looked down at them. Her eyes were wet, but she was smiling.
I'm glad you called. I'm glad I came.
Me too.
She leaned down and kissed his cheek, then Marco's, her lips cool and dry.
Don't wait so long next time. You never know how much time you have.
She walked out, the door swinging shut behind her, and the trattoria fell quiet again. The old woman came out of the kitchen, looked at them, and said nothing. She just nodded as if she understood. They paid and walked out into the night. The street was empty, the air cool and damp. The stars were out, scattered across the sky like grains of salt. Leo stopped, looked up at the sky, and felt something shift inside him. Not the weight he had carried before, but something else. Something lighter. Something that felt like letting go.
You okay?
No.
Good, neither am I.
They walked back to the hotel, their footsteps slow and steady, the city breathing around them. And Leo thought about Alina, about Sarah, about all the ones who had stayed and the ones who had gone, and he realized that the ones who got away were never really gone. They were just waiting, somewhere in the quiet spaces of memory, for you to come back and find them. The next morning came gray and damp, the kind of light that made Venice look like an old photograph. They took the train from Vicenza, riding east through the flat green fields of the Veneto, past rows of cypress trees and small towns with bell towers that had stood for centuries. Leo watched the landscape blur past the window and thought about the first time they had made this trip. They were 15, maybe 16, crammed into a train car with a dozen other kids from the base, all of them loud and restless, passing around a bottle of cheap whiskey someone had stolen from a parent's cabinet. The present-day train was quiet. A few commuters read newspapers. An old woman knitted something pale and delicate. Marco sat across from him, staring out his own window, his reflection ghosting over the green fields.
Remember the time we got lost?
Which time?
The first time, we were supposed to meet everyone at Piazza San Marco. We ended up in some alley behind a fish market.
Leo smiled. He remembered. The smell of the fish market, the slick stones underfoot, the way the canals had all looked the same to two American kids who had never seen a city built on water.
We found it eventually.
2 hours late, everyone had already left.
The train slowed, the landscape giving way to the industrial edges of Mestre, then the long bridge across the lagoon. The water stretched out on both sides, gray and flat, dotted with small islands and the occasional boat. Santa Lucia Station was a chaos of tourists and pigeons and the particular smell of canal water and exhaust. They stepped out onto the grand steps, and there it was, the Grand Canal, the boats, the domes of the churches rising against the pale sky. Leo stood still for a moment, letting it wash over him. He had forgotten how beautiful it was. He had also forgotten how crowded. They bought day passes for the Vaporetto and rode down the canal, standing at the rail, the wind cold and damp against their faces. The buildings slid past, their foundations green with moss, their windows dark and secretive. Every bridge, every alley, every narrow passage between buildings held a memory. They got off at the Rialto and walked into the maze. The streets were packed, tourists from every country, speaking every language, all of them holding maps and phones and gelato. Leo felt the old restlessness rise in him, the need to get away from the crowds, to find the quiet corners. Marco led the way. He had always been the one who could navigate a foreign city by instinct, who could find the hidden courtyard, the empty campo, the bar where only locals drank. They turned down a narrow alley, then another, and suddenly the crowds fell away. They emerged into a small square where a church stood, its facade plain and worn. A fountain trickled in the center. Two old men sat on a bench, not speaking, just watching the pigeons. Leo sat down on the edge of the fountain. The stone was cold through his jeans.
This is what I wanted to find.
It's still here.
They sat in silence for a long time. The old men eventually got up and shuffled away. A cat appeared from nowhere, looked at them with disdain, and disappeared into a doorway. Leo thought about the night they had come here as teenagers. It was late, past midnight, after the discos had closed. They had been with a group. Sarah had been there, and a few others whose names he had forgotten. They had bought bottles of wine from a shop that stayed open for the drunk and the lonely, and they had sat right here on this same fountain, passing the bottles around. He remembered the taste of the wine, sharp and cheap. He remembered the way the stars had looked, brighter here than anywhere else he had ever been. He remembered Sarah laughing at something he had said, her head thrown back, her hair catching the moonlight. He had kissed her that night, just once, quick and clumsy, behind the church. She had pulled away, smiling, and said something he couldn't remember now. And then they had walked back to the station, the streets empty and echoing, and taken the last train back to Vicenza. Marco stood up, stretched, and looked at the church.
Want to see if the steps are still there?
Leo knew which steps he meant. Behind the church, a narrow staircase led up to a small balcony that overlooked the square. They had discovered it one night, drunk and looking for a place to pee, and it had become their spot. They walked around the side of the church. The staircase was still there, rusted iron spiraling up the wall. It looked more precarious than he remembered, but Marco was already climbing, his boots clanging on the metal. At the top, the balcony was barely big enough for two people. They stood shoulder to shoulder, looking out over the rooftops of Venice. The city spread out before them, a jumble of terracotta and stone, domes and towers, the lagoon glinting in the distance. Leo leaned against the railing. It was cold and rough with rust.
It's smaller than I remember.
Everything is.
A bell began to toll somewhere nearby, deep and resonant. The sound rolled across the rooftops, fading into the distance. Other bells answered, one after another, until the whole city seemed to be ringing. Leo closed his eyes and let the sound wash through him. For a moment he was 15 again, standing in this same spot, the world wide open and full of possibility. He could smell the canal water, hear the distant music from a boat, feel the warmth of Sarah's hand in his. Then the bells stopped, and the silence rushed back in, and he was 47 years old, standing in a city that had moved on without him.
You ever think about what we would have been if we'd stayed?
Different people, worse, probably.
Or better, we'll never know.
Leo opened his eyes. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows across the rooftops. The light was golden, soft, the kind of light that made everything look like it was made of honey.
We can't go back.
I know.
They stood there until the light faded and the first stars appeared. The city began to glow from within, the windows lighting up one by one, the canals reflecting the yellow lamps. They climbed down slowly, their footsteps echoing in the empty square. A group of teenagers passed, laughing, speaking Italian too fast for Leo to follow. He watched them disappear into the maze of alleys, their voices fading into the night. And he thought about what Alina had said. The ones who got away. He had gotten away. He had left Italy, left the base, left all of it behind. But standing here in this city that had never belonged to him, he realized that the city had never left him. It was in his bones, in the way he moved through the world, in the quiet places of his memory where the bells still tolled, and the canals still gleamed, and a girl with blonde hair was still laughing somewhere in the dark. They found a small restaurant near the station, the kind of place with plastic tablecloths and a handwritten menu. They ordered pasta and wine and ate without speaking, the silence comfortable, the way it is between people who have known each other for 30 years. When they finished, Marco paid. Leo started to protest, but Marco shook his head.
You can get the next one.
They walked back to the station, the canals dark and quiet, the city settling into its night rhythm. The last train was waiting, almost empty, the lights warm and yellow. Leo took a seat by the window. As the train pulled out of the station, he watched Venice slip away, its lights receding into the darkness, until there was nothing left but the black water of the lagoon and the memory of a kiss behind a church. He closed his eyes. The train rocked gently. Marco was already asleep across from him, his head against the window, his breathing slow and even. And Leo thought about Alina's question, why are we the ones who lived? And he still didn't have an answer. But sitting here in the dark, moving through the Italian night toward a city that had once been home, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Grateful, just that. Grateful to be alive. Grateful to have known the ones he had known. Grateful to have loved, even badly, even briefly, even the ones who had gotten away. The next morning came gray and damp, a low sky pressing down on Verona. They found a cafe near the Piazza Bra, the kind of place where old men stood at the counter drinking espresso and arguing about soccer. Leo ordered a cappuccino, which made the barista raise an eyebrow. After 11, the rules said, but Leo didn't care any more about Italian coffee rules. Marco ordered a cornetto and stood at the window, watching the rain begin to fall. It came slowly at first, then harder, drumming against the awning, sending tourists scattering for cover.
You think they'll come out in this?
The tourists, they'll come out in anything. They paid for the experience.
Marco laughed, a low sound that barely escaped his chest. They finished their coffee and walked to the Casa di Giulietta, joining the slow shuffle of umbrellas through the archway. The courtyard was smaller than Leo remembered, the famous balcony dwarfed by the crowd. People pressed against the gate, touching the bronze breast of Juliet's statue for luck, their hands shiny with the accumulated hope of strangers. Leo stood at the edge of the crowd, watching. A young couple posed for a photo, the woman reaching up toward the balcony, her face bright with the performance of romance. The man held her phone, crouching to get the angle right, patient and adoring. They stepped inside the gift shop to get out of the rain. Postcards and keychains and small statues of Juliet, all of them made somewhere far from here. Leo picked up a magnet shaped like the balcony and turned it over in his hand.
I bought one of these for my mother the first time we came here.
Mine has a pencil sharpener on the back, still works.
They lingered in the doorway, watching the rain fall on the courtyard. The smell of wet stone and damp wool and cheap perfume filled the air. A school group pushed past, their teacher counting heads in rapid Italian. Leo thought about the first time he had come here. He was 14, on a field trip with the base school, and he had stood exactly where he was standing now, pretending to be bored while secretly hoping he would feel something. He had wanted to believe in the story, wanted to believe that love could be that absolute, that tragic, that remembered. He hadn't felt anything then. He didn't feel much now either. They walked to the arena, the old Roman amphitheater squatting in the center of the piazza, pink stone dark with rain. The tour groups had abandoned it, leaving the ancient stones to a few determined couples and a man with a guitar who was playing something Italian and sad under the arches. Leo sat on a low wall and watched the rain puddle between the cobblestones. Marco stood a few feet away, his hands in his pockets, his shoulders hunched against the wet. They had been here before, too. Senior year, the two of them and 4 others crammed into the standing section for an opera. Leo had been drunk on cheap wine and the spectacle, the voices rising into the night sky, the crowd a living thing around him. He had closed his eyes and let the music fill him, and for 3 hours he had believed that this was what life was supposed to feel like.
You remember that operas?
Leo nodded. He didn't say that he had cried that night, alone in the crowd, the tears running down his face and no one noticing. He had been 17 and terrified of the future, and the music had opened something in him that he hadn't known how to name.
I remember the wine.
There was a girl, brunette, she was standing next to you.
Leo tried to summon her face, but it was gone, dissolved into the general haze of that year. He remembered a laugh, maybe, and the warmth of her shoulder against his in the crowd. He remembered wanting to kiss her and not having the courage.
I don't remember her name.
Francesca.
Leo looked at Marco, surprised. Marco shrugged.
You told me about her on the bus back. You said she smelled like cigarettes and flowers.
Leo had forgotten that. He had forgotten the smell of her, the way she had leaned into him during the second act, the way her hair had brushed his arm. He had forgotten that he had ever told anyone about it.
I can't believe you remember that.
I remember everything, that's the problem.
The rain began to let up, the clouds thinning to a pale gray. The man with the guitar stopped playing and packed up his case, nodding to them as he passed. The piazza was quiet now, the wet stones gleaming like mirrors. They walked to the river, the Adige moving slow and green between its ancient banks. A bridge arched across it, lined with statues of saints and lovers, their faces worn smooth by weather and time. Leo stopped in the middle and leaned over the railing, watching the water slide past beneath him. He thought about the different paths, the way his life had gone, the degrees, the jobs, the houses, the money. The way Marco's had gone, the fishing boats, the small apartment, the girl he had married and divorced, the quiet life near the water. They had started in the same place, breathed the same air, loved the same city, and then they had become different men.
Do you regret it?
Regret what?
Not staying, not finding a way to make it work here.
Marco was quiet for a long time. The river moved beneath them, patient and indifferent. A bicycle passed, its bell ringing once, a bright note in the gray afternoon.
I don't regret leaving, I regret not knowing I could have stayed.
Leo turned this over in his mind. It was true, wasn't it? They had been kids, following their parents' orders, believing that the world was divided into places you lived and places you left. It had never occurred to him that there might be a third option, that you could choose.
We didn't know.
No, we didn't.
They crossed the bridge and found a bench overlooking the river. The clouds were breaking apart now, shafts of sunlight falling on the far bank. A church bell began to toll, the sound clear and deep, carrying across the water. Leo sat and let the sun warm his face. He could feel the day fading, the light shifting from gray to gold. In a few hours they would be on another train, moving toward another city. Livorno, then Florence, more ghosts waiting in the wings. He thought about Alina's question again. Why are we the ones who lived? He had known kids who didn't make it. A boy from his math class, dead at 19 in a car accident on the autostrada. A girl from the swim team, gone from an overdose before she turned 25. The ones who had stayed in Italy, the ones who had gone back to America, the ones who had simply vanished into the machinery of life. He had no answer. He had only the fact of his own survival, which felt less like an accomplishment and more like luck. The luck of being born, the luck of not being in the wrong place at the wrong time, the luck of having a friend who still answered the phone after 30 years.
Ready to go.
Leo stood, the bench was cold and his legs were stiff. He looked at the river one last time, at the way the light was catching the surface, turning it to hammered gold.
Yeah, let's go.
They walked back through the quiet streets, past the shuttered shops and the empty cafes. The city was resting, catching its breath between the afternoon and the evening. A woman opened a window above them, shaking out a cloth, and the smell of cooking oil drifted down. Leo stopped at a small grocery and bought a bottle of wine, something local, something he didn't recognize. Marco waited outside, leaning against a lamppost, his hands in his pockets. They would drink it on the train, watching the landscape change from city to country to coast. They would talk about nothing important, the weather, the food, the way the light looked different here than anywhere else. They would not talk about the things they had lost, or the people who had gotten away, or the life that might have been. But for a moment, standing in the quiet street, the bottle warm in his hand and his oldest friend waiting in the light, Leo felt something like peace. Not happiness exactly, something quieter, something that could live alongside the regret and the longing and the grief. Something that felt almost like coming home. The train carried them east through the flat green plain, past rows of corn and sunflowers, past white farmhouses with faded red roofs, past towns that announced themselves with a single church spire and vanished before you could remember their names. Marco sat by the window, his forehead against the glass, watching the landscape blur. Leo opened the wine with a corkscrew he had bought at the grocery, the cheap metal kind that always felt like it would break. He poured into paper cups and handed one to Marco.
Grazy.
They drank in silence. The wine was rough and young, tasting of cherries and earth. It was the kind of wine they had drunk as teenagers, sneaking bottles from their parents' cabinets, drinking behind the bleachers at the pool. The train slowed as they approached the coast. Leo could smell it through the open window, salt and damp and something green, like seaweed drying in the sun. He had forgotten that smell. He had forgotten how it settled into your skin, how it made everything feel possible. They stepped off the train into the heat of early afternoon. Jesolo was flat and bright, a town built for summer and nothing else. The streets were lined with hotels and pizzerias and shops selling inflatable floats and cheap sunglasses. It was garish and loud and entirely unapologetic about it. Marco breathed in deep, his eyes closed.
This is it.
He started walking toward the sea, and Leo followed. They passed a row of beach umbrellas, blue and yellow and red, planted in the sand like flags. The beach was crowded with bodies, families and couples and old men sleeping under newspapers. Children ran in packs, their screams rising and falling with the rhythm of the waves. Marco kicked off his shoes at the edge of the water. He rolled his jeans up to his knees and waded in, not hesitating, not testing the temperature. Leo watched him for a moment, then did the same. The water was colder than he expected, a shock against his skin, and he let out a small sound, something between a gasp and a laugh. They stood there ankle-deep looking out at the horizon. The Adriatic was flat and gray, the color of old silver. A cargo ship sat far out, barely moving, like a toy left on a table.
I used to think this water would remember me.
Remember you.
Like it knew me, like I belonged to it.
Leo said nothing. He understood. There were places that claimed you, that held a piece of you even after you left. The sea was one of them for Marco. For him, it had been something else. The mountains, maybe. The cold air of the Alps. The way the light fell through the trees at Madonna di Campiglio. But standing here now, watching the waves curl and break, he felt it too. A kind of recognition. a sense that this water had been waiting for him, patient and unchanged. They walked along the beach, past the umbrellas and the sunbathers, past a group of teenagers playing volleyball with a flat ball and too much enthusiasm. The sand was warm under their feet, then cool where the tide had wet it. A dog ran past, chasing a stick, its owner calling after it in Italian. Marco stopped at a spot where the beach curved inward, forming a small cove. There were fewer people here, just an old couple sitting in folding chairs and a young woman reading a book.
Here?
He stripped off his shirt and dropped it on the sand. His body was lean and weathered, the skin of his shoulders marked by years of sun. He walked into the water without looking back, wading deeper until the water reached his waist, then his chest, then his shoulders. Leo watched him dive under, watched him surface a few seconds later, shaking the water from his hair. He looked younger. The years had fallen away from his face, and for a moment he was 12 years old again, splashing in the pool at the base, daring Leo to jump. Leo pulled off his own shirt and followed. The water closed over him, and for a second there was nothing but cold and salt and the strange silence of being submerged. He opened his eyes and saw nothing but green, the light filtering down in long, slow shafts. He surfaced, gasping, and found Marco floating on his back, staring up at the sky.
You remember the pool.
Every time I smell chlorine.
The way the sun hit the water in the afternoon. The way it felt like we were the only ones in the world.
Leo floated beside him. The water was buoyant, holding them without effort. The sky above was pale blue, almost white, the sun a smear of heat behind the clouds. They floated for a long time, saying nothing. The waves lifted them and let them fall. The shore was a distant line of color. The noise of the beach was muffled, as if coming from another world. For a few hours it worked. The years genuinely fell away. Leo forgot about the money, the houses, the women he had loved and lost. He forgot about the lottery, about the feeling of winning something he hadn't earned. He was just a body in the water, a boy with a friend, a life that was still ahead of him. But the sun began to drop. The light shifted from white to gold to orange, and the shadows lengthened across the sand. The families packed up their umbrellas and chairs. The teenagers put away their volleyball. The beach emptied slowly like a room after a party. They walked out of the water, their skin cold and wrinkled, their teeth chattering. They sat on the sand and watched the sun go down. It was beautiful, the way sunsets always are at the edge of the sea, but there was something sad about it, too. The end of something, the return to the real.
We used to think we could stay forever.
In the water.
Everywhere.
Leo picked up a handful of sand and let it run through his fingers. It was coarse and full of tiny shells, fragments of things that had once been alive.
What happened to that?
We grew up.
They sat in silence as the sky turned red, then purple, then a deep blue that was almost black. The first stars appeared, faint and uncertain. A breeze came off the water, cool against their wet skin.
I'm glad we came.
My toe.
They did not say anything else. They just sat there, two middle-aged men on a beach in Italy, watching the night take over the day. The sea kept moving, indifferent and eternal. The waves kept breaking. The stars kept appearing, one by one, until the sky was full of them. And Leo thought, this is what we came for, not to go back, not to relive anything, just to be here together in the place where we once belonged, just to remember that we belonged somewhere. The road to Madonna di Campiglio wound through the Dolomites like a scar, switchback after switchback, the air thinning with every kilometer. Leo drove, his hands steady on the wheel, while Marco watched the mountains rise around them, their peaks still holding snow even in late summer. They had left the coast that morning, the salt still dried on their skin, and driven north through Verona past the lakes into the spine of the country. The landscape changed gradually, then suddenly, the flat farmland giving way to foothills, the foothills to rock, the rock to these immense cathedrals of stone that seemed to have no business being so beautiful.
It's smaller than I remember.
Everything is.
They found their hotel at the edge of town, a 3-story building with wooden balconies and flower boxes overflowing with geraniums. The woman at the reception desk was young, maybe 25, with the kind of efficient friendliness that comes from working in a ski town.
You are here for the hiking. The summer paths are very beautiful.
Leo said something about old memories, about having come here as a boy, and her face softened into a smile that suggested she understood, even if she couldn't possibly. Their room was simple, 2 beds, a bathroom, a window that looked out at the slopes. Leo dropped his bag on the floor and stood at the window, his hands in his pockets. The chairlift was still running, carrying hikers up and down the mountain. The grass on the slopes was green now, not white, but the shape of everything was exactly the same. The curve of the run they had taken 100 times, the ridge where they had hidden from the ski patrol, the clump of trees at the bottom where they had once built a jump and nearly broken their necks. He remembered the cold. He remembered it better than anything. The way it bit at your cheeks and made your eyes water. The way your fingers went numb inside your gloves. The way your breath hung in front of your face like a ghost. The first time they had come here, it was with Leo's father, who had rented a van and driven them all up from the base. Leo's father had been a sergeant, a quiet man who drank too much and said too little, but who had understood something about boys, that they needed to be taken places, that they needed to be shown the world. They had skied all day, until their legs were jelly and their faces were numb. And then they had gone back to the rented apartment and eaten pasta and drunk warm beer and fallen asleep on the floor in their sleeping bags, too tired to even talk. The second time they had come alone. They were 16, and they had saved up their money from odd jobs, and they had taken the train from Vicenza to Trento, and then the bus up into the mountains. They had lied about their ages to rent a room at a pension, and they had brought a keg of cheap beer that they had smuggled in a duffel bag. That was the trip Leo remembered best. The trip where everything had felt possible, where the future was a distant rumor that didn't matter, where they had stood on the slope at night, drunk and reckless, and shouted at the stars. He turned from the window.
You want to go up?
Marco was already pulling on his jacket. They took the chairlift to the top. The ride was slow and silent, the only sound the mechanical hum of the cable and the occasional creak of the chair as it passed over a tower. The mountain fell away beneath them, the trees thinning as they climbed, the air growing cooler. At the top, they stepped off the chairlift and walked to the edge of the slope. The view was vast, peaks in every direction, their ridges sharp against the sky, the valleys below filled with the green of summer. A few hikers moved along the trails, small as ants against the immensity of the landscape. Marco stood with his hands on his hips, breathing deeply.
The air, I forgot about the air.
Leo nodded. It was different here. Thinner, cleaner, colder. It made you feel awake in a way that the air at sea level never did. They walked along the ridge, following a trail that ran parallel to the slope. The grass was short and tough, dotted with wildflowers, purple and yellow and white. A stream cut across the path, clear and fast, and they stopped to drink from it, cupping the water in their hands. Leo remembered the night, the specific night. It came back to him in fragments like pieces of a dream. They had snuck out of the pension after midnight, carrying the keg between them, their boots crunching in the frozen snow. The moon was full and the slope was lit up like daylight, every shadow sharp and black. They had buried the keg in a snowbank near the trees, and then they had skied down the run in the dark, laughing, shouting, their headlamps cutting thin beams through the night. There had been girls, 2 girls from Milan on vacation with their families. They had met them at a bar in town, had bought them drinks with the money they had saved, had brought them back to the pension and stayed up all night talking, kissing, feeling like gods. He could not remember their names. He could not remember their faces. He remembered the sound of their laughter, the shape of their bodies in the dim light, the way one of them had smelled like cigarettes and perfume. He had thought that night that he would never forget any of it, that every detail would be etched into him forever, and now he could barely hold onto the edges.
You remember the keg.
Buried in the snow.
We thought we were so smart.
We were.
Marco laughed, a short, dry sound.
We were idiots, we could have died, skiing in the dark, drunk on a run we barely knew.
But we didn't.
No, we didn't.
They walked further along the ridge until the trail dipped down into a bowl-shaped valley, sheltered from the wind. There was a small lake there, blue-green and perfectly still, ringed by pines. A family was sitting on the shore, eating a picnic, their voices carrying across the water in a language Leo didn't recognize. They sat on a flat rock near the water's edge. The sun was warm, but the air was cool, and Leo could feel the heat of the rock through his jeans. He closed his eyes and let his face turn toward the sun. He thought about the years between then and now. The years that had taken him from this mountain to a desk in North Carolina, from a boy who believed in nothing but the next moment to a man who counted his days in spreadsheets and quarterly reports. He had built a life. He had made money. He had done everything he was supposed to do. And yet, he opened his eyes. Marco was looking at the lake, his face unreadable.
What are you thinking?
That I miss being 16.
Me too.
They sat in silence for a long time. The family finished their picnic and packed up, their voices fading as they walked away. The lake stayed still, reflecting the sky, the pines, the mountains. A bird called somewhere in the trees, a single note repeated over and over.
Do you think we were happier then?
Leo considered the question. It was the kind of question that seemed simple but wasn't. He thought about the feeling he had carried with him through his 20s and 30s, the sense that something had been lost, that the best years were behind him. But he also thought about the anxiety of being 16, the uncertainty, the constant pressure to become someone, to figure out who he was.
I think we were more alive.
What's the difference?
Happiness is a destination, being alive is just being.
Marco nodded slowly. He picked up a pebble and tossed it into the lake. The ripples spread outward, concentric circles that grew fainter and fainter until they disappeared.
I don't know if I want to go back, but I want to feel that way again.
Leo didn't answer. He didn't have an answer. He watched the ripples fade, watched the lake return to stillness, and felt the weight of the years pressing down on him, heavy and familiar. They stayed until the sun began to drop behind the peaks, casting long shadows across the valley. The air grew colder, and Leo could smell the pine, the damp earth, the faint metallic tang of snow that was still melting somewhere higher up. They walked back to the chairlift in silence, their footsteps loud on the gravel path. The chairlift operator was waiting for them, a bored teenager with earbuds in his ears, and they rode down as the light turned gold, then orange, then a deep purple that seemed to come from nowhere. In town, they found a restaurant with a terrace overlooking the main square. They ordered wine and pasta and sat watching the evening unfold around them. Families with children, couples holding hands, groups of young people heading out for the night. Leo thought about the girls from Milan. He wondered where they were now, if they ever thought about that night, if they ever remembered the two American boys who had skied with them in the moonlight. He raised his glass.
To being alive.
Marco raised his.
To being alive.
They drank. The wine was red and full-bodied, and it warmed him from the inside. The stars were coming out one by one, and the mountains stood dark against the sky, patient and unchanged. And Leo thought, this is enough. This is all there is. A mountain, a friend, a glass of wine, the rest is just noise. They drove south from the mountains the next morning, leaving the cold air and the pines behind. The highway unspooled through a landscape that changed slowly, first the steep green of the Alps, then the rolling hills of Tuscany, then the flat, open farmland that smelled of dust and hay and something sweet. Leo drove. Marco watched out the window. The radio played something Italian, a woman's voice singing about love and loss, and neither of them felt the need to fill the silence. They reached Livorno in the early afternoon. The light was different here, softer, paler, filtered through a haze that hung over the coast like a veil. The air smelled of salt and fish and diesel, the complicated smell of a working port city. Leo found a parking spot near the waterfront. They got out and stood for a moment looking at the harbor. Ferries and cargo ships, fishing boats with peeling paint, a few sailboats with their masts clanking in the breeze. They walked along the promenade. The sun was warm but not hot, and the breeze carried the sound of seagulls, the distant clatter of cranes unloading cargo, the low hum of a city going about its business.
It's not what I remembered.
Leo looked at him. Marco's face was hard to read, not disappointed, not surprised, just something in between.
What did you remember?
I don't know, cleaner, brighter. I think I remembered it the way it looked in my head when I was 17.
Leo understood. He had done the same thing with Vicenza, with Venice, with every place they had visited on this trip. He had carried a version of each city in his memory, polished and preserved, and each time they arrived, the real city had been different. Not worse, not better, just older, like them. They found a beach south of the city, past the naval base, where the sand was dark and coarse and the water stretched out gray-green under the hazy sky. There were a few other people scattered along the shore, a couple with a dog, a man reading a newspaper, a woman lying on a towel with her eyes closed. They sat on the sand, close to the waterline. The waves were small, barely a foot high, but they came in a steady rhythm, a sound that seemed to exist outside of time.
The first time we came here, I thought I was going to die.
That was the train.
No, the train was later, this was the bus.
Leo laughed. The sound surprised him. It came out rough, almost rusty, like a door that hadn't been opened in years.
I remember the bus from Florence, the guy with the accordion.
He played the same song for 2 hours. I wanted to throw myself off the viaduct.
They had been 17. It was spring break, and they had talked their way onto a bus full of Italian students heading to the coast. The bus had been hot, crowded, and the accordion player had been relentless, a small man with a mustache and a smile that never wavered, cranking out a melody that seemed to have no beginning and no end. They had sat in the back, pressed against the window, sharing a bottle of cheap red wine that Marco had stolen from his father's cupboard. The wine was warm and harsh, and it made them feel older than they were, more connected to the world passing by outside the window. When they reached the beach, they had stripped down to their shorts and run into the water without checking the temperature. It had been cold, shockingly cold, and Leo remembered the feeling of his breath leaving his body, the way his skin had tightened, the way he had laughed and gasped and felt completely, perfectly alive.
We were idiots.
The best kind.
They sat in silence, watching the waves. A dog ran past, barking at nothing, its owner calling after it in Italian. The woman on the towel rolled over and opened her eyes, glanced at them, then closed them again. Leo picked up a handful of sand. It ran through his fingers, coarse and dark, leaving a residue on his palm. He thought about all the beaches he had stood on, all the water he had looked at, all the moments he had let slip through his hands.
Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we'd stayed?
Stayed where?
Here in Italy, if our fathers had stayed at the base, if we had just not gone back.
Marco was quiet for a long time. The waves kept coming, kept falling, kept pulling back.
I used to think about it when I was in college. I'd lie in my dorm room and imagine a different life. I'd be living in Venice maybe, working on the water, speaking Italian every day, marrying an Italian girl.
What stopped you?
Nothing stopped me, I just never did it.
Leo nodded. He understood that too. The gap between what you want and what you do, the distance between the life you imagine and the life you actually live. It was the longest distance there was. He thought about the girls they had met on that spring break trip, two sisters from Rome on holiday with their parents. They had spent the day together, swimming and laughing and sharing food, and at the end of the afternoon the older sister had kissed him. Her name was Alina. He had never seen her again.
What was her name, the one with the green eyes?
Alessia.
Right, Alessia.
Marco had been in love with her for exactly 3 days. They had exchanged letters for a few months after, long handwritten letters that smelled of perfume and cigarette smoke, and then the letters had stopped, and Marco had moved on, or at least pretended to.
She married a doctor. I looked her up once years ago. She lives in Milan.
Are you glad you looked?
I don't know, I think I wanted to know that she was happy, and she seemed happy, so maybe.
The sun was starting to drop, the light turning golden, the haze thinning. The beach was emptying, the dog and its owner gone, the man with the newspaper folding it under his arm and walking away. Leo stood up. He brushed the sand off his jeans and walked to the water's edge. The waves washed over his shoes, cold and sudden, and he didn't move. He stood there for a long time, watching the horizon, where the sea met the sky in a line so soft it seemed to dissolve. He thought about Alina, about the kiss, about the feeling of being 17, and believing that everything was possible. He had believed that once, that the world was open, that the future was a blank page, that he could write any story he wanted. And then somewhere along the way, he had stopped believing. He had started writing the story that seemed most practical, most sensible, most likely to succeed. And he had succeeded. He had the house, the car, the retirement account. He had the life he was supposed to have. But standing here on this beach in this light, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. A crack in the armor. A glimpse of something younger, wilder, more alive.
We should go, it's getting dark.
Leo turned. Marco was standing behind him, hands in his pockets, his face half in shadow.
Yeah.
They walked back to the car in silence. The city was lighting up, the windows of the buildings along the waterfront glowing yellow and orange. The harbor was quiet, the boats rocking gently in the dusk. Leo got behind the wheel. He sat for a moment, his hands on the steering wheel, looking at the darkening sky through the windshield.
I think I've been wrong.
About what?
About what I was looking for.
Marco didn't answer. He just sat there waiting.
I thought I wanted to go back, to be 17 again, to have it all ahead of me, but that's not it.
What is it?
Leo thought about the beach, the waves, the girl he had kissed and never seen again. He thought about the bus, the accordion, the warm, cheap wine. He thought about the feeling of being alive, not happy, not successful, not safe, just alive.
I think I just wanted to remember what it felt like, to be here, to be us.
Marco reached over and put a hand on his shoulder. It was a small thing, a brief thing, but it said everything.
We're still us.
Leo started the car. The engine hummed, steady and familiar. He pulled out of the parking spot and headed north toward the highway toward whatever came next. Behind them, the sea kept moving, the waves kept falling, the light kept fading, and Leo thought for the first time in a long time that maybe that was enough. They drove north out of Livorno, the coast road curving inland through olive groves and vineyards, the light falling long and amber across the fields. Leo kept the windows down, and the air that came in smelled of dust and rosemary and something sweet he couldn't name. Marco had his head back against the seat, his eyes half closed, watching the landscape slide past. He hadn't said much since the beach. Neither of them had. But the silence was comfortable, the kind that only came after years of knowing someone, after all the things that needed saying had been said or set aside. The highway rose ahead of them, and Leo merged into the lane, the car settling into a steady hum. The sun was behind them now, the sky ahead turning violet and deep blue. They reached Florence just after dark. The city was a trap of narrow streets and one-way signs, and Leo missed the turn for the hotel twice before Marco pointed silently at a parking garage. They left the car in a concrete tomb that smelled of exhaust and damp stone and walked out into the warm evening air. The streets were crowded, tourists and locals alike filling the sidewalks, the chatter of languages rising and falling like music. A group of students sat on the steps of a church, bottles of beer in their hands, laughing. A woman with a guitar sang something sad and slow near the mouth of an alley. Leo stopped at a small trattoria, the kind with plastic chairs and handwritten menus taped to the window. He pointed, and Marco nodded, and they sat down at a table by the street, the tablecloth sticky with wine, the candle flickering in a glass jar. A waiter came, old and tired, and Leo ordered in his rusty Italian, the words coming slow but correct. The waiter nodded and disappeared.
Your Italian's still better than mine.
I remember more than I thought I would.
They ate in silence for a while. The pasta was simple, with tomato and basil and olive oil, and it tasted like something Leo had forgotten he loved. Halfway through the meal, a young couple sat down at the table next to them. The woman had long dark hair and green eyes, and for a moment Leo felt a pang of something, not grief, not longing, just a recognition. A reminder of all the versions of himself he had been, all the people he might have become. He looked away. After dinner they walked. Through the Piazza della Signoria past the Palazzo Vecchio, the stone lions watching from their pedestals. Across the Ponte Vecchio, the jewelry shops shuttered, the river black and silent below. Up toward the Duomo, its massive dome rising against the dark sky, floodlit and impossible, a monument to the arrogance and beauty of human ambition. Marco stopped in the middle of the piazza and looked up.
I used to think about this place all the time. After we left, I'd lie in bed in Texas and try to remember what it felt like to stand here.
And no,
It's smaller.
Leo laughed, a short, surprised laugh.
everything is.
They sat on the steps of the cathedral, the stone cool through their clothes. A few other people were scattered around them, couples mostly, talking in low voices. The air was soft and warm, and somewhere nearby a fountain was running. Leo thought about the last time they had been here. It was the summer after junior year, a few weeks before Marco's family was supposed to rotate back to the States. They had come on a day trip, just the two of them, with a backpack full of sandwiches and a bottle of cheap wine they had bought from a man who didn't ask for ID. They had climbed the dome that day. 463 steps, up the narrow staircase that curved inside the shell of Brunelleschi's masterpiece, their shoulders brushing the walls, their breath coming hard. And at the top, when they emerged into the light, the city had spread out before them like a promise. They had stood there for a long time, not saying anything, just looking. Leo remembered the feeling, the wind on his face, the heat of the stone under his hands, the knowledge, sharp and certain, that this moment would never come again.
Do you remember the climbs?
Yeah,
I was scared. I didn't tell you at the time, but I was scared. The stairs were so narrow. I kept thinking about what would happen if someone panicked, if there was a fire, if we got stuck.
you never said anything.
I didn't want to ruin it.
Leo nodded. He understood that too. The way you protect the best moments by keeping the fear to yourself. The way you pretend you're not afraid so that the other person can be happy. They sat in silence for a while longer. The sky was completely dark now, the stars faint above the city lights. A church bell tolled somewhere, the sound deep and resonant, carrying across the rooftops. Leo checked his watch. It was almost midnight.
We should go back. We have a long drive tomorrow.
Where are we going?
I don't know. I thought maybe we'd just drive, see where we end up.
That sounds right.
They stood up. Leo stretched, his back cracking, and they started walking back toward the hotel, their footsteps echoing in the empty streets. They passed a small bar, the door open, music spilling out. A woman's voice, singing in Italian, slow and sad. Leo stopped for a moment, listening. He thought about all the nights they had spent in places like this. The discos in Vicenza, the bars in Jesolo, the crowded piazzas where they had stood with bottles in their hands and girls pressed close, and the whole world seemed like a room they could fill with their laughter. He thought about the morning after, the walk home in the gray dawn, the taste of cigarettes and regret, the promise to do better, to be better, to make something of the life ahead.
You ready?
Leo turned. Marco was waiting a few steps ahead, his hands in his pockets, his face half lit by the glow of a street lamp.
Yo.
They walked the rest of the way in silence. The hotel was small, the lobby empty except for a night clerk who barely looked up from his phone. They took the stairs, 2 floors, the carpet worn thin, the walls painted a color that had once been cream. Leo's room was at the end of the hall. He unlocked the door and stepped inside, the light from the hallway falling across the bed, the cheap furniture, the window that looked out onto a courtyard. He sat down on the edge of the bed. The room was quiet. The city was quiet. He took out his phone and looked at the screen. No messages, no notifications, just the time, the date, the small icon that showed the battery was half full. He thought about calling his ex-wife. He didn't know why, just a reflex maybe, the habit of reaching out to someone who no longer wanted to be reached. He put the phone down. Through the wall he heard Marco moving around in the next room, the creak of a bed, the sound of water running, then nothing. Leo lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling, the crack in the plaster, the shadow cast by the lamp, the faint hum of the city beyond the window. He closed his eyes. He thought about the climb, the narrow stairs, the light at the top, the way Marco had been scared and hadn't said anything. He thought about all the things they had never said, the fears they had carried alone, the moments they had protected by staying quiet. And he thought about tomorrow, the open road, the unknown destination, the chance maybe to start saying some of those things out loud. He must have drifted off, because the next thing he knew, the room was darker and the street noise had changed pitch. Fewer cars, more voices, the late-night hum of people spilling from bars. A knock at the door, soft, tentative, not insistent.
Yo.
The door opened. Marco stood in the hallway, his hair wet, wearing a t-shirt he'd owned since they were 17. It was faded now, almost gray, the letters of some long-dead band barely visible.
Can't sleep.
Leo sat up. The clock on the nightstand said 1:47.
Me neither.
Marco didn't come in. He just stood there, one hand on the doorframe, looking past Leo at the window.
You remember the last night before we left?
Leo knew exactly what he meant. The last night in Vicenza, the summer after sophomore year. Their fathers had both received orders, Leo's to Fort Bragg, Marco's to Fort Hood, and they had known for weeks that the end was coming. They had spent that final evening doing what they always did, riding their bikes through the streets of the base, past the commissary and the bowling alley and the chapel, past the houses where other military kids lived, the ones who would stay behind and forget them. They had ended up at the pool, the same pool where they had met 3 years earlier, both of them 12 and awkward and desperate to belong to something.
The pool.
Yeah.
Leo remembered the chain-link fence, the way they had climbed it, the wire digging into his palms, the way the water had looked in the moonlight, black and still and perfect. They had swum in their clothes, t-shirts and shorts, the water cold against his skin, the chlorine smell rising up around him. They hadn't said much, just floated looking up at the stars, the sky above the base so much darker than the sky above the city. At some point Marco had started crying, quietly so that Leo almost didn't notice, just the slight tremor in the water, the way his breath caught. Leo hadn't said anything. He had just reached out and put a hand on Marco's shoulder, held it there. They had stayed like that until the sun started to lighten the sky, and then they had climbed out, soaked and shivering, and ridden home. Marco stepped into the room now. He sat down on the edge of the bed, facing the window, his back to Leo.
I've been thinking about that night a lot since you called.
Me too.
A long silence, the kind that could hold anything.
I thought about calling you over the years, 100 times 1,000.
Why didn't you?
Marco didn't answer right away. He picked at a loose thread on his shorts, his fingers working the frayed edge.
I don't know, I think I was afraid you'd be different, that I'd call and you'd be someone I didn't recognize. and then I'd have to admit that we weren't the same people anymore.
Leo thought about that. The way we hold onto the past by refusing to touch it. The way we keep people frozen in amber, preserved exactly as they were, because the alternative is too painful.
I am different.
Marco nodded slowly.
I know, so am I.
They sat with that for a while, the truth of it settling around them like dust. Leo looked at his hands, the same hands that had gripped the handlebars of his bike, that had pulled himself over the chain-link fence, that had held Marco's shoulder in the dark water. Older now, the knuckles a little thicker, a scar on his thumb from a broken bottle years ago in a fight he barely remembered.
But I'm still me.
Marco stood up. He walked to the window and looked out at the courtyard below. A cat was moving along the wall, its tail high, its steps careful.
Do you think we can ever really go back?
Leo considered the question, the title of their trip, the lie they had been telling themselves for a week.
No,
Marco's shoulders dropped slightly, as if he had been bracing for a different answer.
but I think we can go forward from the same place.
Marco turned. In the dim light, his face was unreadable.
That's not bad.
No, it's not.
They stood there across the small room from each other. Two men in their 40s, worn down by life in different ways, carrying different scars and different regrets, but connected by something that had not broken. Something that had bent but not snapped. Leo's phone buzzed on the nightstand. He glanced at it. A notification from the hotel reminding him of checkout time, 11 a.m. He picked it up and turned it off.
Tomorrow we'll start driving, no plan.
No plans.
Just see where we end up.
Marco nodded. He walked to the door and stopped, his hand on the handle.
Leo,
Yo,
Marco didn't turn around. His voice was quiet, almost lost in the space between them.
I'm glad you called.
Leo waited. The words felt bigger than the room could hold.
me too.
The door clicked shut. The footsteps moved away down the hall into the room next door, the creak of the bed, the sound of water running. Leo lay back down. He didn't close his eyes. He just stared at the ceiling, at the crack in the plaster, and let the night settle around him. Tomorrow they would drive. They would cross the plain of the Veneto, the mountains rising on one side, the sea on the other. They would pass through towns they had visited as boys, towns they had passed through without thinking, towns that had gone on existing after they left, just as they had gone on existing after everyone they knew had moved on. He thought about the pool, the chain-link fence, the cold water, the way Marco had cried and he had not known what to say, so he had said nothing, and that had been enough. He thought about all the moments that had mattered, the things they had done without knowing they were making memories, the way the past holds on to us, even when we try to let it go. Outside, the city breathed. A car passed. A voice called out laughing. A door closed somewhere, soft and final. Leo closed his eyes. Tomorrow they would drive. And that would be enough. The morning came gray and soft, the light filtering through thin curtains like water through cheesecloth. Leo woke first, as he always had, and lay still for a long moment, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of a hotel waking up. A toilet flushing somewhere above. A child's voice in the hallway, speaking Italian, the words quick and musical. He showered without hurry, let the water run hot until the steam filled the small bathroom, stood there longer than he needed to, letting the heat work into his shoulders, into the knot that had taken up residence there sometime in his 30s and never fully left. When he came out, Marco was standing at the window, already dressed. His bag was packed, sitting by the door. He was holding a cup of coffee from somewhere, steam rising in a thin spiral.
There's a place downstairs, the espresso's good.
Leo nodded. He dressed in the same clothes from yesterday. There was something appropriate about it. The last day of a trip, you didn't need fresh things. You were already carrying the dust of the road. They checked out without ceremony. The woman at the desk was polite, professional. She asked if they had enjoyed their stay. Leo said yes. Marco said yes. Both of them meant it, but the words felt small. The car was in a garage 3 blocks away. They walked in silence, past a bakery where the smell of fresh bread spilled out onto the street, past a newspaper stand, past a church where an old woman was unlocking the heavy wooden door. Leo got behind the wheel. Marco settled into the passenger seat and reached for the radio, then stopped himself, left it off.
Which way?
Leo looked at the map on his phone. The blue line of the highway stretched south and west, toward the coast, toward Livorno, where they had never gone together, only ever passed through on the way to somewhere else.
Let's go see the sea.
Marco smiled. It was a small thing barely there, but it was real.
Yeah, let's do that.
The engine turned over. The garage swallowed the sound and gave back nothing. They drove out of the city through streets that grew wider and straighter as they went, the medieval tangle giving way to post-war functionality, then to fields and factories and the long gray ribbon of the autostrada. For a while, neither of them spoke. The landscape unrolled like a slow film, vineyards, rows of cypress trees, a billboard for something they couldn't read at speed, a truck carrying grapes, the smell of them sweet and heavy for a moment as they passed. Leo thought about the last time he had driven this road. He had been 17 in the back of someone else's car, the windows down, a girl's head on his shoulder. He couldn't remember her name. He could remember the way her hair had smelled, like shampoo and smoke and something floral. That version of himself was gone, a stranger, someone he could watch but not reach. Marco shifted in his seat. His hand went to the window, tracing a line in the condensation.
Do you remember the time we tried to hitchhike to Jesolo?
Leo laughed, a short, surprised sound.
We got picked up by that guy in the Fiat. He kept calling us ragazzini.
And then he bought us gelato. I still don't know if he was trying to kidnap us or just lonely.
Maybe both.
They drove in comfortable silence for another hour. The sun burned through the clouds and the fields turned gold. The mountains appeared on the left, blue in the distance, familiar in a way that made Leo's chest ache. They stopped at a roadside bar for coffee and a panino. The man behind the counter was old, his hands gnarled, his eyes sharp. He asked where they were from. Leo said America. The man nodded as if that explained everything and went back to polishing glasses. Outside, they sat at a plastic table. The air was warm but not heavy. A dog slept in the shade of a tree. A tractor went by, slow and loud.
I keep thinking about that night at the lake.
Leo knew which night. He didn't need to ask.
Me too.
Marco picked at the label on his water bottle. His fingers worked the edge of the paper, peeling it in a slow spiral.
I don't think I ever told anyone about that, what happened, what I did.
Leo waited. He had learned over the years that silence was sometimes the best answer.
I came pretty close after, a few times, not because of that exactly, but it was part of it, a thread I kept pulling.
The words hung in the air. Leo wanted to say something. He wanted to reach across the table and take Marco's hand, the way they might have when they were boys, before they learned that men weren't supposed to touch each other that way. Instead, he said nothing. He just sat there present, letting Marco know he was there.
I'm okay now, I think. I don't know, it comes and goes.
That's the deal, isn't it?
Yeah, I guess it is.
Leo's phone buzzed, a text from his sister asking if he was okay. He typed a quick reply, all good, on the road, I'll call you. He put the phone face down on the table.
We should go if we want to make the coast by sunset.
Marco nodded. He stood up slowly, his knees cracking. He looked older in that moment, the years visible in the way he moved.
One more thing.
Leo looked up.
Thank you for the call for this whole stupid thing.
It wasn't stupid.
No, it wasn't.
They got back in the car. The engine started, the road waited. They drove through the afternoon, through towns with names they remembered and towns they had never seen. The landscape changed. The flat fields of the Veneto gave way to rolling hills, then to the sudden blue of the sea, appearing at the edge of a curve like a gift. Leo pulled over at a lookout. They got out and stood at the railing, the wind in their faces, the water stretching out to the horizon. Below them a beach, a few families, a dog running in the surf, the sound of children laughing carried up on the breeze. Marco leaned on the railing. His eyes were on the water, but he wasn't looking at it. He was looking through it at something else, something only he could see.
I used to think that if I could just get back here, everything would make sense, that I'd find the version of myself I lost somewhere along the way.
Leo stood beside him, their shoulders almost touching.
And
I don't know if I found him, but I think I found out he was never really lost, just buried.
Leo nodded. The wind picked up and he closed his eyes for a moment. Let the salt air fill his lungs.
you can never go back.
No,
But you can go forward from the same place.
Marco turned to look at him. His eyes were wet, but he was smiling.
that's what you said last night.
I meant it.
They stood there until the sun began to drop toward the water, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and the deep purple of coming night. When they got back in the car, Leo didn't start the engine right away. He just sat there, his hands on the wheel, watching the light change.
Where to?
Leo thought about it. The whole country lay ahead of them, all the roads they had never taken, all the places they had promised to see and never did.
Let's just drive.
Marco leaned back in his seat. He let out a long breath.
Okay.
Leo turned the key. The engine hummed. They pulled back onto the road. The sea on one side, the mountains on the other, and the whole of Italy spread out before them like a promise they weren't sure they could keep. And they drove. And that was enough. The static faded. The road continued. Two men in a car, moving forward, carrying the past with them, but no longer trapped inside it. The sun set. The night came. And somewhere ahead, the lights of a small town blinked on, one by one, welcoming travelers they had never met, who would pass through and be forgotten, who would leave nothing behind but the memory of a car passing in the dark. And that, too, was enough.